The iPhone 14 Pro Max is Apple's latest attempt at exemplifying what it means to be a flagship smartphone. It's powerful, it's pricey, and it's purple, but how well did Apple do at succeeding the 13 Pro Max that came before it, and does it really live up to all the hype? Well, that's what we're here to find out today. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Bellroy is a global brand that covers all your everyday carry needs. And this time, they're back with 3 new cases for the iPhone 14 lineup. To start things off, they have the Mod phone case and wallet. Made of an eco-tanned leather, it feels great in the hand, while its microfiber lining ensures it won't scratch your devices. It's super slim and integrates perfectly with their Mod wallet, which snaps into place on the back and holds 3 cards securely in place. Next up, they have the Bio phone case. It's made of an organic-based polymer and bamboo filler, so at the end of its life, it can be composted, breaking down in about 6 months. But you aren't giving up on protection, as it's also their most protective case yet. It's super slim, looks great, and is backed by their 3-year warranty. Finally, they have the 3-card phone case. Rather than the removable wallet of the Mod case, this one integrates the card holding directly into the side. It's made of that same eco-tan leather to look and feel great, and the magnetic door on the back keeps your cards safely tucked away while keeping your device protected. Coming in a variety of colors, all of Bellroy's cases will complement your iPhone's look without adding a ton of bulk. If you head down to the link in the video description, you can pick up one of these cases and get an exclusive 10% off anything on their site. Thanks again to Bellroy for sponsoring today's video.
Outside of the dynamic island, which we'll get into in a bit, there really isn't much new stuff going on aesthetically with this phone. And at first you might feel like there should have been more changed, but what should they change, honestly? Sure, they could get rid of the massive camera bump, but I think Apple has their reasons for letting it stick around, and it's one of the iPhone's most distinct physical features. But other than that, I think this design is as functional as it needs to be. When it comes to the new purple color, I think it's a bit of a letdown in terms of how it appears under certain shades of light. It's just a little too dull and understated in my opinion, and I think their Pacific Blue and Midnight Green colors are the best Pro phone colors Apple has done thus far. But you obviously don't have to choose purple, there's still the standard set of Apple alternative colors. I think the new display on the 14 Pro Max might be my favorite aspect of this phone from a usability standpoint, and not even exclusively due to the dynamic island. The 14 Pro Max is now 40% brighter at the top end, and that's made a huge difference for me whenever I'm out and about and have the sun blaring over my display. I haven't had a single moment of wishing this display could get brighter, which is not something I could say for the 13 Pro Max. And this increased brightness benefits HDR content as well, which I pretty much shoot everything in at this point. You'll now be able to natively view HDR content that pushes brightness up to 1600 nits. And that's not a necessity at all, but it sure is nice to have. The display also has a slightly higher resolution, but that also isn't something you would notice from a day-to-day perspective. And with all these improvements, I think the 14 Pro Max has the best display you can get in a smartphone at this price point. Period. Now, the dynamic island is the #1 marketing push for the Pro iPhones this year. They finally removed the notch after 5 very long years, and functionally, this is an improvement over the notch. When you connect earphones, play music, silence your phone, use a navigation app, or watch videos, the dynamic island will play into all of that. And it's an extremely fluid setup that doesn't take that long to get used to. It's a very competent way of making the camera notch something that's actually usable, but I do have a slight gripe. The thing is, with the notch, after a while you would just not notice it being there. But with the dynamic island, it never disappears, because if you're not interacting with it, it's just always very present when doing things like watching full screen videos or scrolling through a document with a light colored background. It's just an extremely noticeable thing. And while I still appreciate the fact that the dynamic island can do things, I somewhat miss the fact that the notch was something that you could just not think about after a while. It's a thoughtless aspect of the design. That's not the case with the 14 Pro Max. And after using this for weeks, I very much feel like this feature should have been implemented in the non-14 Pro models as well. This feature is cool and looks like futuristic, but there's nothing pro about it. And yes, we know that Apple has a very open-ended mindset when it comes to the word pro, but I think Apple might have been hurting themselves more than they would have helped themselves by reserving this feature for the Pro iPhones, because that would have been one feature that would automatically make people think of the number 14 instead of just 14 Pro. But hopefully this comes to the entire 15 lineup next year. The display also now has an always on mode, and you can turn this feature off in the settings if you'd like, but this way, unless your phone is in your pocket or face down, you'll always see any active notifications, your wallpaper, and widgets in a slightly dim state. There isn't really any customization for this feature, so it only works in the way Apple has it set up here, but if this is something you've been wanting on your iPhone, you can finally use it with the 14 Pros. But honestly, given how pretty functionless this feature is, I'd recommend just turning it off. Honestly, it'll definitely help with the battery life if you don't have this feature on. Now, a somewhat big issue that Apple kinda just threw at us was the removal of the physical SIM tray for the US made iPhones, which means that you have to set up an electronic SIM in order to get service on an iPhone made for the US. And it's safe to say that carriers, Apple, and everyone else were not prepared to make this transition because there were a lot of technical issues going on in the back end, people waiting for days to get proper service, myself included. It was a big mess. But now that the frenzy is frozen over, so to speak, I know that's an issue that I shouldn't have to deal with going forward. And it's cool to know that eventually we'll be at a place where we don't have to worry about dealing with physical SIM cards. But for traveling internationally, this does raise some questions that I'd honestly like to know the answer to. I'm actually going out of the country in a month, and I actually have no idea how I'm going to handle getting service out there. But I guess that's another problem for another day. The performance of the iPhone 14 Pro is one of the more underwhelming aspects of the phone, and that's mainly because the 13 Pro Max was already so good in that arena. Remember that the chip powering this phone is essentially in the same architecture family that's powering Apple computers. So lag is nowhere to be found. Pretty much anything you throw at this phone, it can handle. The A16 Bionic chip powering the iPhone 14 Pros isn't really a substantial on-paper upgrade from last year's A15. It's got the same amount of cores all around, but the A16 is different in the fact that it's running on a smaller 4nm process, which means it should be more efficient doing the same kinds of tasks. As far as how that efficiency has actually played out for me in real-world usage, well, I honestly can't tell how much better it is, especially with the battery life I've been getting, which I'm going to get into later. But overall, this isn't a sluggish phone by any means. It just really isn't that much faster than the 13 Pro Max in a way that I can actually notice. So, the battery life of the 14 Pro Max has certainly been the weakest point of the experience for me so far. To be clear, I'm averaging about 8 hours of screen on time, which is pretty freaking good, obviously, but at least coming from the 13 Pro Max, I've noticed that I'm ending the day with about 10 to 15% less battery life than I did on the 13 Pro Max. I would usually end the day with about 55 to 57% battery life, and with this 14 Pro Max, I usually end the day with about 40 to 43%. I mean, that's still fine, but it's just disappointing to know that the 14 Pro Max has had worse battery performance than the last phone. But this somewhat makes sense because the battery in the 14 Pro Max is physically smaller this time around. It's only about by 30 milliamp hours, which is next to nothing, but maybe that has actually made a noticeable difference. Or maybe it's just iOS 16. Perhaps there's a software update waiting in the wings that could improve the battery performance. Only time will tell, but I will say that if you can afford this $1,100 phone, I think it's reasonable to say that you could probably afford a portable charging solution to go along with this phone if you find that the battery life is not up to your standards. Two safety-oriented features that Apple made sure to make note of in the keynote is firstly a feature that enables satellite connectivity in the event of an emergency. This will enable you to put your iPhone up at the sky and contact emergency services if you have no cell service, and I'm fortunately not going to be able to test that for you. But the new crash detection feature uses sensors and mics within the iPhone to determine whether you've been in a crash and allow you to easily contact emergency responders. And there is someone who actually tested crash detection. Luke Miani and Sam Cole from iUpdate made an insane video where they tested out crash detection on the iPhone and the new Apple Watch to see how well it actually works, and there will be a link to that video in the description down below. The second biggest marketing push for the new 14 Pro is the new 48 megapixel main sensor in the rear camera, which is a huge jump over the 12 megapixel sensor we're used to and have had for years. This new sensor is using quad pixel technology, which means that you've now got a 2x zoom option, which is enabled by all the enhanced detail you're getting with this 48 megapixel sensor. In terms of the photo experience, I gotta say this is a pretty noticeable jump over the 13 Pro Max in terms of natural detail and depth of field. When putting it side by side with the 13 Pro Max, you can definitely see the differences, but I'm a professional videographer and tech reviewer, so I pay attention to these details. It's my job. And so when putting it on its own, I'm not sure how much the average user would be able to tell how much better this camera is. The dynamic range and low light performance of the 13 Pro Max was already great, and the 14 Pro Max is even better, but again, not by a huge margin, and if I were to quantify it, I'd say maybe about 15 or 20% better, but overall, when it comes to the rear cameras for photo taking, the biggest gains are going to mostly be in the improved natural detail and depth, which are all welcome changes in my opinion. In terms of the video, the only features to take note of this year are a new action mode, which improves stabilization through software when filming handheld, and then there's now a 4K mode for the cinematic video feature that was introduced last year. Action mode is pretty cool in terms of its ability to stabilize footage with a lot of movement. The only downside is that you're not getting the full 4K resolution. It's a downsized 2.8K frame. But this is no surprise to anyone who's tried to stabilize footage within a video editor before. Everything always gets cropped out a little bit in that process. Cinematic video getting 4K is cool too. You can tell a difference versus 1080p, but it's not a wow feature. It's almost like buying something and then getting an upgrade that makes it the way you thought it always should have been from jump. But overall, video performance isn't too different this year, and that's fine because last year's camera was already excellent for video, and in my opinion, this is the best video taking smartphone in existence. The front-facing camera has definitely improved from my testing versus the 13 Pro Max. I'm seeing more detail, substantially better color accuracy, and a lower aperture sensor. So the low light should be a tad bit better, and I think the biggest feature of them all is fully fledged autofocus for the front camera for the first time ever. When you think about how many people use the selfie camera for live streaming, posting stories, recording themselves, and so on, I think there's an argument to be made that the front camera should be nearly as capable as the rear cameras, and I'm glad Apple's made these improvements this time around. It's clear that the 14 Pro Max isn't perfect, but even with its flaws and drawbacks versus the 13 Pro Max, like the battery performance, I think I can still confidently say that this is the most capable iPhone Apple's ever produced, and there's a whole lot to love about this phone if you're coming from a 10s Max, an 11 Pro Max, even the 12 Pro Max. The display is killer, the dynamic island is a really nice usability touch, the cameras are still best in class, especially for video, and the overall performance leaves very little to complain about. If you want the biggest, baddest iPhone, I think this is definitely worth it this year, if that's what you're looking for. As far as next year though, I think firstly, Lightning port has got to go. We need USB-C on the Pro iPhones at least. And now that we've got a 48 megapixel sensor, we should be able to do 8K video recording, and I honestly thought we were going to be getting that this year. And then lastly, faster charging, both for wireless charging and wired charging, because that is one area where the iPhone is still way behind everyone else at this point. But after that, I honestly can't think of too much more to throw in this thing. What do you guys think though? Did Apple do well with this year's Pro iPhone? Let us know in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.